Well, we'd like to welcome you to our third Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual Alumni Association Homecoming Lecture. The GLB alumni, which we call ourselves the alums, were established in 1992, and we officially received recognition from Wisconsin Alumni Association in 1994. We are still the only Big Ten university who their gay lesbian alumni group has received official sanction within the alumni. So it's a pretty proud thing for us to be #1. And as many of you know, we do our July reunion brunch, and we have started in the spring doing a program for gay, lesbian, bisexual graduates. And 3 years ago, when we thought about homecoming and all of the hordes of red and white gowned folks around, and we knew that there would be gay, lesbian folks who are coming back to town, and we decided we'd like to do something. And so the lectures have come out of we wanting to do something. And tonight, we're very distinguished to have Professor Mosse with us. Our first lecture was John D'Amelio, and last year we had Lisa Dugan, and tonight we have Professor Mosse. For those of you who are soon-to-be alums or are alums and you have not signed up to be a part of the Alumni Association, we would love to have you. And there's materials in the back as you came in that you can pick up, and we hope you enjoy the lecture. And I'm going to turn it over to Dick Wagner.
After Mary Alice's remark, I guess I'm the hordes in the red and white, for the evening at least. One of the things that gay people have been able to do at various times is pass, and so I have been this afternoon with all of the other members of the National Alumni Association, and one of the interesting things that I heard there was that the diversity efforts that the National Wisconsin Alumni Association has undertaken has increased their contacts with some 15% of the alums who previously they didn't have much contact with, and that they are making a very serious effort to get beyond boosterism, which has traditionally been the image of hordes of red and white. And so if they're willing to get beyond boosterism, I'm willing to get my red and white sweatshirt out. And so I figure we'll meet them somewhere in between. But that's not really what I'm here to do. I'm here at really a special honor to introduce George Mosse. And George received a special recognition at our summer brunch, and he spoke there briefly. And folks commented that they would like to have George have a chance to say more because of the interesting things that he had to say, and which he has been researching and writing about recently. And we asked him, and he very graciously said yes. He is indeed a noted author and has published extensively, including Toward the Final Solution, A History of European Racism, The Crisis of German Ideology, Nationalism and Sexuality. And lately, he's sort of been, I guess, retired or professor emeritus, and, but he's still busy writing and looking at the notes in his recent book. I noticed articles, National Socialism, Nudity and the Male Body, Beauty Without Sensuality, so it's clear that he's still very productive as a scholar. When I was here as a graduate student at the university, it was sort of the fabled George Mosse who was teaching on this campus, and he indeed was one of the stars of the Madison faculty. He has continued that tradition, and he is now Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, the Bascom Weinstein Professor. He's also Professor of History Emeritus at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In 1996, the book that he published is The Image of Man, and it's subtitled The Creation of Modern Masculinity, and it begins with one of those notes about how people would talk about the need to be a man. And I can remember that phrase thrown at me as I was struggling myself with trying to figure out who I was and how I was going to decide to lead my life. And so the works that George has published and which he has taught have tried to, I think, provide the ways that we can structure the reality that we are living. And he concludes this work with a note that all those who want to change society, as well as those who want to escape their marginalization, have to take the stereotype of modern masculinity into account. And so we're very pleased that George is with us tonight and is going to talk about why gay history, and I'm very honored to have this introduction for George Mosse. George?
I'm kind of sorry that I have to stand up here so far away. As long as you don't believe everything I say just because I'm up here, it'll be all right. Now, Dick said that I should talk why gay history, but I've changed it a little because this afternoon I want to be much more concrete than that, but to illustrate completely why gay history is important for us, not just that we know our past, but also that we know our present and perhaps a little of our future as well. The concrete and relevant example I'm going to use today will be the greatest persecution of homosexuals in modern times, namely under the National Socialists in Germany. I am here not concerned, as people usually are, how many died, how many were in concentration camps, and all of that, but rather with the context in which this persecution took place. We all know that it happened. We all know about the camps. We all know that about 50,000 gays perished. But that is really not my point. My point is the context, which seems to me all important. And though after 1933, gays were actively persecuted and condemned to death unless they could prove that they had mended their ways, the Nazi here, and this is really one of my chief points, the Nazi here invented nothing new, but merely took the hopes and fears of society and brought them, as it were, to a boiling point. The very success of National Socialism was that it always worked within familiar contexts, present traditions, and used already existing prejudice. When we look at gay persecution, then the bottom line is this. What really counts is that it is set in a continuity, that it isn't something that suddenly welled up and happened, but it was set in a certain continuity, and that continuity seems to me all important to discuss. At the time, and until relatively recently, the Nazis were regarded as opponents of bourgeois society, as opponents of middle-class society. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, supposedly a house painter, they were ruffians without any education. I remember very well that my father, who was what you might call a newspaper lord in Germany, believed until 1933 that Hitler belonged on the comic pages of our newspapers and not in the main part of it. And indeed, in their speeches and writings, the Nazis did attack constantly the fat, rich, and cowardly bourgeoisie. In Hitler's speeches, bourgeoisie meant indecision, wimpiness, unsoldierly behavior. But notice, nothing whatsoever in these tirades touched bourgeois respectability, an image that the Nazis themselves were only too keen to project. Respectability, meaning good manners, behavior, normative sexuality, and gender division, above all, was the mirror through which society saw itself, and of course still largely sees itself today. All this is thoroughly documented through what the Nazis did immediately they came to power. Immediately they came to power, one of their very first actions was to ban all pornography, yes, to close all dance halls, if you like, and to get rid of nudism in all its form. But what has that to do with our fate? If one looks at all those whom the Nazis persecuted, an important pattern emerges on the background of what I have just said, the quest for respectability in a respectable society. Let us take as an example, a law which the Nazis proposed in 1943 and which they called the Law for the Treatment of Those Unable to Sustain a Community. Now, that was the basic accusation. These people could not sustain a community. But who were these people? Those who refused to work, vagrants, the permanently dissatisfied, beggars, the mentally impaired, the crippled, and the homosexuals. You must add to those the Jews and the gypsies. Now, what do all of these have actually in common? All of these I just read out. They represent the exact opposite of the ideal society, or the ideals which society is supposed to stand for. The exact opposite of the work ethic, settledness, moderation, control over one's passions, especially control over one's sexuality. Moreover, all these virtues are not merely inward properties. Most important, these virtues were thought to leave their mark on the body and face. I know many of you will think immediately, quite rightly, of Oscar Wilde, the picture of Dorian Gray. That's quite correct. It was generally considered that virtue and vice are written on your face and on your body as well. It was assumed then that one could at a glance distinguish between the virtuous, and those who had no virtue, that, as it were, their appearance gave them away. Now, for us, this is of very special importance. The Nazis regarded themselves as a state of males, a society based on male camaraderie. And the male body became an important symbol of the regime. When you went, for example, into Hitler's Reichschancellery to see the Chancellor, the first thing you would see were two statues of nude youths, the nude male body as symbol from the first. Now, what sort of a male body is the question? Now, ever since the 19th century, an ideal of male beauty had grown up, an ideal of male beauty which was indeed sought to reflect the hopes and wishes of society. It was based on the young Greek males whom at the beginning of the century an art historian called Winkelmann, a homosexual by the way, an art historian called Winkelmann had rediscovered, and his history of ancient art went like a wildfire through Europe and really created what we call the ideal male type until today. What is it? A harmonious body. A body that documents moderation and yet power. Or as Winkelmann said, quiet strength. He thought in these nude Greek youths, the plays of the muscles were the dynamic, and their whole figure was the harmony. Therefore, in this way, visually, you could solve one of the main problems of bourgeois society, of reconciling order and dynamic. These Greek youths reconciled in their very male bodies order and dynamic. They projected this in their quiet strength, in the moderation, in their harmony. And that was important, for we are now in a time where society seemed to be on the brink of chaos. Starting with the age of Winkelmann and the Industrial Revolution, society seemed on the brink of chaos. And here was an example of quiet, of restraint, of moderation, and yet, if you like, of power. And so you get, very briefly, an ideal male type, which was important. For as the saying was in the 19th century, the male body represents all of society. Women's bodies represent only part of societies. Now, once I've said that, why is that important? It's important because the outsider, all those are mentioned in these Nazi laws, are therefore the exact opposite. Disproportionate in appearance, their passions out of control, no moderation, everything is in motion. And now comes something which really got me onto this topic, by the way. All outsiders look alike. If you look at the caricatures of gays, of Jews, of vagrants, yes, of the insane, they all look exactly alike because they are the exact opposite of the male stereotype. They are puny, they have these bad bodies, they don't walk, they waddle, yes, all of that. They have no necks usually, yes, they are wimpish, you know all of this. But you've never asked yourself why they should look that way. And why they should look that way, and this is very effective, is that they're the exact opposite of the ideal type. And in this way, society gets its self-confidence. For our society has always had enemies. There wasn't a time when our society didn't have enemies. And those enemies boost society's self-confidence. And especially now, because with the 19th century, we are in a visual age. People don't read anymore, you should know that. They see. Long before television, that was true. They don't read anymore, they see. It's a visual age. And therefore, these kind of images become all important. Now, though gays were said, of course, not to sustain a community, in reality, and here again in the opposite, they did sustain a community, only it was the counter-community. It was a community based on conspiracy. It was a community based on cheating and lying, all the opposite of the manly virtues. It was a state within a state. Do you hear echoes? Am I sounding like Senator Helms or Mr. Dorman? This is not an accident. This is not an accident. These people just repeat long-standing ideas. Nothing new whatsoever here. Gays were a menace, therefore. They were a menace for many reasons. They were a menace documented by their looks. They were a menace because they were thought to be ill. And the metaphor illness and the gays is very important in an age when illness and health became ever more important. Not quite as obsessive as today, but anyway, ever more important. And moreover, gayness, like being a Jew, was an infectious disease, a very important accusation in the age of syphilis. Syphilis was Hitler's great obsession, and not only Hitler's great obsession, but this idea of an infectious disease was very important. Now, gay history confronts all of this. Already in the 19th century, homosexuality was thought to be a neurotic illness, And by the way, Jews also were supposed to be especially subject to insanity. Here, immoderation, excitement, bodily contortion, all of this, normally, all of this characterized them. Now, what was the reaction of normative society? Normative society marginalized these people. It marginalized them. It sought to exclude them, but it did not seek to exterminate them. Whatever you can say about normative society, you excluded them, you ghettoized them, but you did not exterminate them. So what made the difference between exclusion and marginalization and extermination? It's a big difference, no? It's racism which makes the difference. And in this regard, racism also affected gays. Not just the Jews, of course, but gays as well. Gays obviously play a different role than Jews or gypsies here. Jews or gypsies are clearly an inferior race and must be exterminated root and branch. But with gays it was more difficult. Most gays were, after all, Aryans. So you could not take this road. So you took another road, a road hallowed by a long medical tradition, which had believed ever since mid-19th century there were two sorts of homosexuals, those who had inherited homosexuality and those who had been seduced in their youth and could be cured, what in German is called Scheinhomosexuals, who were seduced in their youth and could be cured. Now it was clear that those who could not be cured, who had inherited homosexuality, were like an inferior race because they menaced the race. They menaced the race by destroying it from within. And those who had been seduced in their youth, they could be cured. And so, as some of you know, no doubt, the Nazis invented ways that you could tell. If a gay was put into a concentration camp, one of the first things that was done, he was taken to the local whorehouse and put in bed with a whore and see if he functioned properly. If he functioned properly, he was released. If he did not, of course, then he stayed in the camp and probably died. So that you have this distinction which got around this very real problem that most, after all, homosexuals were of the proper race, as it were. It is typical here that gays in occupied countries, like Holland or France, were never really persecuted at all, for it was quite right and proper that those countries were undermined from within by the gays. And so you have in France the spectacle that known and famous gays like the playwright Cocteau or the Minister of Education of the Vichy government, Bonnard, were honored by the Nazis. Not persecuted, but honored by the Nazis. So you have that spectacle. And in Holland, something very similar, by the way, happened. Now, all of this may seem straightforward. Here are the gays being persecuted. Here are the gays coming to camps. Here are the gays allowed to pass. But there's one other factor, which is less straightforward and perhaps more distressing. And that has been usually a taboo in research up to now. The certain attraction which National Socialism had for many prominent gays. The self-conscious male state, male bonding, the idea of male beauty put up in front, as it were. All this made its mark here as well. The prospectus which the Berlin gays just put out for their new monument to the victims of National Socialism says in it that the homosexuals could be perpetrators as well as victims. That, I think, is exaggerating the case. But it is true, probably, it is true, nevertheless, that there were groups, and even the first homosexual journal ever published in Germany, called Der Eigene, starting in 1903, was racist, anti-Semitic, and put forward the ideal male stereotype. So there was the attraction. There was the attraction here. That must be said as well. Nevertheless, the Nazis shut down this periodical at once in 1933 and didn't take at all into account that its founder was a racist and a Nazi, in fact. It made no difference in this case. Now, we must say, however, here at once, that throughout modern age, the outsider always has wanted to be an insider. That is nothing new. You've heard of the nose job. You've heard of hair straighteners for Afro-Americans and all of that, yes? It's nothing new, of course, at all. But here again, the Nazis brought out the extremes. Some gays assimilating and indeed supporting an overtly hostile regime, which, however, wanted to erase not all homosexuals, just some of them. It is all more distressing, and I must say this, because it's very distressing to me what I'm saying now, what I'm going to say now, that even anti-Nazis and anti-fascists in the 1930s made use of the existence of homosexuals in a manner which differed not at all from the way that the Nazis made use of them. The Nazi leadership was constantly pictured as a coterie of homosexuals, a perception, of course, which was encouraged by the Nazis as a male state, as I have said. Anti-fascist literature made most of this accusation, and indeed a homosexual, Klaus Mann, the novelist, the son of the writer Thomas Mann, put it very well. He said, and he was leading in the anti-fascist movement, he said, the homosexuals are the Jews of the anti-fascists. I think that's quite a true and a very shrewd insight. The communists led very strong support here from the beginning. Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, constructed a sexual relation between Hitler and Röhm, his admitted homosexual chief of staff. But above all, what went throughout the left literature is a saying of Maxim Gorky, much revered writer and symbol in the Soviet Union, who said, if you exterminate the homosexuals, fascism will vanish. Now, in all of this, such propaganda was a means to make out the Nazis as not respectable people, obviously. But even that even homosexuals joined can show you to what extent in these pre-war years the focus was on defeating National Socialism. That was, after all, the main focus. You mustn't forget that. Defeating National Socialism at all costs. And here the means justified the ends. But in addition, it demonstrates how widespread and deep gay prejudice was, so that one almost took it for granted. I must tell you, I myself was active in the anti-fascist movement at the time. And looking back from it today, I didn't give it a thought that we used these accusations constantly against the National Socialists. Yes? That was almost a staple, which we took totally for granted. That gives you something of the depth of all of this, the depth of, if you like, this kind, which is not merely unthinking, but this kind of social attitude. The history of gays under Nazi persecution, then, is not a simple tale of numbers and camps, but has much deeper roots. To be sure, most gays, I'm pretty convinced, escaped. They faked a cure which could be done even in the camps, as I said. Moreover, and that's often forgotten, gays were freed by the judicial system, even under the Nazis, if there was not enough evidence, because people forget that the German judicial system functioned more or less normally even under the Nazis themselves, though they were often re-arrested as they left the courthouse. They were often re-arrested as well. But above all, gays, of course, disguised their real nature, which they could do much better than the Jews. Why? Because they had practice in doing that. While for the Jews, this was by and large completely a new and unprecedented situation of which very few took advantage. At every turn, therefore, gays confronted normative society, which they could join if properly disguised, and at the same time they were victims of society's ideals. Now here I must say what I said at the beginning. The Nazi persecution basically continued the traditional existing policy of marginalization, of seeing homosexuality as the enemy of normative society. Perhaps, as I also said, our society needs an enemy for its own self-affirmation and finds it in those who are perceived to be different. But in addition, the gays menaced one of the chief pillars of society, the whole concept of respectability, which in the last resort is built on gender divisions. And anything which menaced gender divisions also menaced, as it were, society, was also thought to menace society as a whole. Racism transformed discrimination into a struggle of life and death. That's what racism did. It brutalized all it touched through its concept of permanent war. Gays became foils in that war, those believed to be true homosexuals. Racism always thought in stereotypes and not in terms of individuals. And here it wanted to erase, as they said at one point, not homosexuals, but homosexuality. You could never say that about Jews. You could never say, I want to erase Judaism, but not Jews. That would have been quite a different kind of matter. But Jews were the inferior race, the lowest on the totem pole. And you could not say that, but you could say it here. The metaphor of disease was always uppermost, one which was familiar and readily understood, and is again come to the surface with AIDS. As you well know, so many people in Congress have said, you know, AIDS is an infectious disease, and then this whole, what I've talked about, comes again to the surface. It's nothing new. It's nothing new at all. It comes again to the surface. But above all, I suppose, when all is said and done, homosexuality became a metaphor, a lightning rod for the fears of modernity, always present in the perception of the gay stereotype, in the pictures, in people's minds. After all, the frightening speed of time, the uncertainty, the rapid change, as opposed to the security of tradition, led people to seek shelter in the normative, in the familiar, in the solid. And both the Nazis and racism, nationalism, if you like, and racism worked with what was most familiar, the human stereotype. The human stereotype became typical for virtue and vice, for being a good citizen. What I've talked about really is the origins not only of the male stereotype, but within it, the origins of the all-American boy and the clean-cut shaven Englishman. And they all go back to that homosexual Winkelmann, which they don't know, of course. Now, why then gay history? so that we can learn, perhaps, even from the extreme experience which I've talked about, that basic to the desire for extermination, in this case as in others, are traditional concepts of sickness and health, virtues and vice. Racism always makes prejudice deadly, but it could not have worked without exploiting already existing trends and fears of respectable society. These ideas in modern times were always thought to be under siege, though in reality, of course, they are familiar and generally accepted as the cement of a society. Now, I think myself, this is what gays still basically face today, as they did then, both as temptation and as the foe, even though the frontiers of the permissible have been extended to an unimaginable extent which you couldn't have possibly imagined much earlier. The question, it seems to me, is not, are we going to be totally emancipated? That is, to me, not the question. The question is, as long as we have the structure of society we have, as long as respectability holds and holds well, and most of us can't even think what comes after respectability. We can't even think what comes after respectability. As long as that holds, the question is, how far can it bend? How permissive can it be? Where are the borders when it retrenches again? You can say about today, for example, fine, in the 60s everything was open. There was general gender bending. When you went down Main Street, State Street here, you couldn't tell from the back is a boy or a girl, yes? Anything. You couldn't, yes? But then we retrench again. Look at the boys in this audience here, yes? They look like the 50s. Yes? No gender bending here, as far as I can see, or as I walk down the campus. So we have again, respectability has its due, if you like. You have again the retrenchment. When I said that some years ago to a general first gay and lesbian international meeting at Amsterdam, I got attacked terribly. Because, of course, what I say is rather pessimistic. I'm saying I don't see any complete emancipation without a complete change in social structure. I do not see that. And in the cement which holds society, as it were, together. So it seems to me the peripheries are in question. Now, to be sure, one must fight the day-to-day battles, but the study of gay history can get us to confront the underlying factors which drive the persecution and discrimination itself. They are not always on the surface or found in the heat of the moment, but they have to do with society's self-image and society's defensive posture. How much room they will allow is, of course, difficult to say. But I remind you that all that which is traditional and familiar, all that which we are used to and in whose peripheries we move, under certain circumstances can be deadly to any minority, as they have been in the past, as I've tried to explain to you this afternoon. It is always latent within them, always latent within them, in my opinion. And the question is, again, the periphery with which in all this can work. The Nazis, of course, had a hierarchy of evil in which the Jews were the driving force. But gays, as incurable, were close to the top. Both were connected for the Nazis, as indeed the outsider presented an evil. The outsider which, as it were, threatened and attacked the things which were thought to bind society together. Outsider and insider, therefore, are the same pieces of one whole, yes? They are joked together, if I can put it that way, yes? The outsider becomes the mirror, the convex mirror of the insider, yes? And the insider, I doubt, could exist without this convex mirror. So I think both are, in effect, linked together as well. Here again, continuity is important, in my opinion. And indeed, the outsiders, and I want to end with that, were linked. I think that's a very important realization, which in practice is not always followed. It's hardly ever followed, yes? They are linked. Jews and homosexuals are linked. For example, Jews were thought to be especially subject to homosexuality. And whenever a Jew in the 30s, for example, reached a prominent position, he was so accused. Let me give you two examples. The German foreign minister in the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau, was always thought to be a homosexual and so accused, and much more startling, the prime minister of the French Popular Front government in the late 30s, Léon Blum, was always pictured as a cross-dresser, always pictured in a woman's dress by his enemies. So the outsiders are together, yes, which I hope I have made clear. As I said, they look alike, and are linked together by society itself. Jews were thought to have, and I quote, a soft weakness of form, and are therefore in constant risk not only of madness, but of being homosexuals. Gay history, then, to end, cannot just tell us where gays stand in the fabric of society itself, what role they play in society's self-image, but can also highlight the obstacles which have to be overcome. That seems to me extremely important. I've always wondered, especially in the last years as I've done this research on male stereotypes, why the women's movement has never been more concerned with the male stereotype. As long as the male stereotype is still so deep and again so victorious. In Germany alone, there are 5,000 bodybuilding parlors, or as I like to say, body sculpting, because it all has to do with male beauty, parlors, yes? It seems to me that is one real obstacle, not just to women's emancipation, but to gay emancipation, to the emancipation of all minorities, which have to be overcome. I have then dealt or tried to deal with factors which make prejudice so effective and long-lasting. There have been, and this is startling, no change in the view of any of these minorities over the last centuries. You can do that by pictures. Look at their caricatures in 1850 and in 1990, and you will see they're exactly the same, because the male ideal is still with us. They're exactly the same, and they have not vanished, just as the male ideal hasn't vanished, just as respectability is still with us and has not vanished. And I think that if we have any hope of changing all this, we must know where we stand. And that's why I've given you this mini lecture today. Anyone have questions, or are we going to go to... No, we have some time for questions, I'm being told. Let me do what I'm told here. Yes.
Well, I think you're bound to get it from somebody, Professor Mosse, but
you have to talk up a little, the acoustics here.
This observation that, and I got some laughs from the audience about being able to tell no difference between male students today, for example, around campus, around State Street, compared to back in 1950.
Yeah.
I think is probably generally accurate, right? If you're walking up Bascom Hill and looking at the clean-cut boys who work out at surf and all of that, as a general population.
Yeah.
But there are definite exceptions to that, and especially when you start looking at the gay population, within that. And I noticed some guys in the audience here sort of looking at themselves or at each other and comparing the way that they looked and kind of shaking their head and thinking, no doubt, that well, that doesn't apply to me, and probably by extension isn't generally true. I think there's probably been that shift. I'm probably
but
myself,
let me just tell you one astonishing fact. If you look at the ideal male, yes, as I've described him, have you? Maybe ask you, have you ever looked at gay pornography? But in gay pornography, if you go through gay pornography, and I have a friend who has a big collection, if you go through gay pornography, you will find that all these models go according to these Greek youths. They don't have a hair on their body. Their faces are chiseled. Do I have to go into gory detail on it? No.
Well, I would still call exception to it because that's one of the things about gays in particular, first of all, that it sets off incidents of gay bashing. The very fact that they don't look like, the all-American boy or whatever, the way they wear their hair or the way they, and I'm talking about specific subpopulations, right? Not gays.
No, you have a very big change, which I didn't address, of course, and that is the change that came with gay emancipation. Don't forget, that's something new. And that means gays self-confidence. There are now a hell of a lot of gays who don't want to hide anymore or pass anymore. That would not have been so in my youth at all. That would not have been so in my youth at all. You would have quite a difficult time finding gay subcultures, let us say, not in Berlin as a special matter, but in let's say, New York or anywhere else, perhaps, yes? Today you have no difficulty in that. And in fact, they influence the fashion industry. You know all that, yes? So I think, I'm glad you brought that up. That is certainly a change, yes? That gays have confidence, and yet, I bet anything, that if a gay, any gay in this audience for that matter, is in company of an effeminate gay, he's uncomfortable as hell. That I've observed again and again. Again and again. I mean, a really effeminate gay is uncomfortable. There's no reason why he should be. I mean, they don't bite or anything. So, no reason really. But you are. It has something to do with that. I think I'm right in that.
What about the effeminate gay, though?
Huh?
What about the effeminate gay?
Well, yeah.
I just wanted to, what you're saying reminds me a fair amount of what George Chauncey found in New York in the early part of the 20th century, which was a lot of different gay cultures or identities, but an emerging gay male identity, a sort of emerging dominant gay male identity that was very much the identity of a respectable straight male, and was pretty close to what at least I'm not exactly sure where we are right now. That's always my problem. I'm more comfortable 200 years ago, but it seems at least to me to have been pretty close to what was one of the dominant gay male identities in the 70s and 80s, which was, I agree with you, a sort of claiming not a passing, but a gay identity that was at the same time moving itself toward that kind of presentation of the male body. Just one comment, if I may, about the 60s. It might be that you couldn't tell men and women apart if you were behind them walking down the street, but it always interested me that as men started growing their hair long, they also started growing more facial hair. As if a signal somehow still had to be given.
Yes, I didn't think of that. Of course, I could say a lot about the androgynes. There hasn't been much work on the androgyne. I thought here that with a colleague here in the English department, we're going to put out a source book on John on the androgynes, which would have been very interesting. But even when you have public androgynes like Boy George or Michael Jackson, yes, they are very clear to disavow that they're not homosexuals. They go to great lengths. They go to great lengths. But you don't have much of an androgyne look. In this book of mine, The Image of Man, I reproduce a Veracci advertisement, yes? And say, find the girls. The boys look just like girls, yes? But that was, I think, is perhaps something rather of the past. I don't know.
You used the phrase bourgeois respectability rather a lot, but comes to mind a phrase you did not use, but I think probably means the same thing, family values.
Well, that's the same thing.
Yeah.
They mean roughly the same thing.
Yeah.
Roughly the same thing. But yes, I do think they mean the same thing, as far as I'm aware of it. Yes, somebody here. Did you have
you were mentioning, the male ideal is one sort of part of the mechanism of marginalizing a group of people.
Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that humans come equipped in all cultures and times with on-board mechanisms for generating xenophobia and genocide, if you like, and we'll discover some way or another, this being one, to generate another or a marginal group.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree with you. I mean, as I said, society has always had its enemies, which has affirmed it, yes? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they have genocide. I mean, in a sense, the whole respectability with its emphasis on moderation and so on speaks against that, yes? And the Nazis had a very, very difficult time, all fascists, had a very, very difficult time reconciling the ideal of a male society with family values, because they espoused both, yes? So that was extremely difficult for them, and they never quite succeeded. They never quite succeeded.
You talked about the need for pushing one group down because of the feelings of insecurity of the group in power.
Yeah.
Can we address somewhat the need for that? Why is it a power issue of control, or
No,
what's going on?
I don't think it's just an issue of control. It is an issue of security, above all.
Why the need for security?
Well, because you live in an age that is insecure all around you.
Uh-huh. Okay.
There's nothing secure anymore, really. Yes? Whatever.
By the
So,
nature of being bourgeois, you mean?
People are turned loose. I mean, this has started long before today. People are turned loose, and so they seek shelter.
Uh-huh.
They seek shelter in nationalism. Nationalism and the Industrial Revolution grew up at the same time,
Right.
roughly, yes. They seek shelter in what I call the short-end bourgeois society, in the construction, in respectability, in the construction of a hierarchical society, and a hierarchical society, all of that, yes. You want to know where you are. You want to know where you stand. What does one of the presidential candidates constantly says? You know where I stand. People like that. You want to know where you stand. I don't, because all it makes is hypocrisy. Have you ever thought of the real life of all the people who talk about family values? It makes your hair stand on edge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.